The small-town barista had been invisible for months, just another middle-aged guy steaming milk and wiping counters, until a nervous customer whispered something in Farsi, and he responded with perfect pronunciation and a look that made everyone freeze. Welcome to the Intelligent Stories. Before we continue, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who were never meant to be forgotten. The town of Millbrook had exactly one coffee shop, one traffic light, and one secret that nobody knew they were keeping. The coffee shop was called Bean There, a name that made tourists smile and locals roll their eyes. It sat on the corner of Main and Oak, wedged between a hardware store that had been closing down for 15 years and a barbershop that only cut hair on Tuesdays. Behind the counter, every morning at 5:30 a.m. sharp, stood a man who went by the name David Chen. Medium height, graying hair, hands that moved with quiet efficiency around the espresso machine. He wore the same uniform every day, dark jeans, plain white t-shirt, and a black apron that he washed at home every night. He never called in sick, never showed up late, never asked for time off. The regulars knew his routine by heart. Mrs. Patterson got her decaf with 2 creams at 6:15. Jake from the gas station grabbed a black coffee and a blueberry muffin at 6:45. The morning shift nurses from the county hospital stopped by around 7:30 for their complicated orders. Extra shot this, oat milk that, sugar-free everything else. David remembered every order without writing anything down. He never made small talk beyond, "How's your morning?" and he never asked follow-up questions. When customers tried to chat about the weather or complain about politics, he'd nod politely and find something else to clean. People assumed he was just shy, maybe a little antisocial. The kind of middle-aged guy who'd taken a simple job to avoid complications. What they didn't know was that David Chen wasn't his real name, and the man behind the counter had once sat in rooms where decisions were made that changed the course of nations. His real name was classified, buried in files that didn't officially exist. For 12 years, he had been a CIA operative specializing in Middle Eastern affairs. He spoke 7 languages fluently, had run assets in 4 different countries, and possessed a memory trained to absorb details that most people would never notice. He could identify accents down to specific regions, spot surveillance from 3 blocks away, and read body language like most people read newspapers. He had retired quietly, officially, with full pension and a recommendation that he disappeared completely. No forwarding address, no contact with former colleagues, no digital footprint that could connect him to his previous life. The agency had given him a new identity, a clean background, and enough money to start over anywhere he wanted. He had chosen Millbrook because it was exactly the kind of place where nothing ever happened. Population 3,200, 1 Main Street, and the kind of community where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was the perfect place to hide in plain sight. For 18 months, the strategy had worked perfectly. He served coffee, he went home to his small apartment above the used bookstore, he watched old movies and read paperback novels, he grocery shopped on Sundays, paid his bills in cash, and slowly began to believe that his old life was just a memory that would fade with time. But old habits die hard, especially when they've been burned into your nervous system by years of training and experience. David still woke up at 4:30 a.m. without an alarm. He still scanned every room when he entered it, automatically cataloging exits and potential threats. He still noticed when strangers came to town, when regulars changed their routines, when something felt off in the rhythm of daily life. That's why he noticed the man in the gray suit before anyone else did. It was a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of crisp autumn day that made the leaves look like they were on fire. The usual morning rush was winding down. Mrs. Patterson had taken her decaf to go. Jake was long gone with his muffin, and the nurses had cleared out after their caffeine fix. Only a few customers remained, Tom Miller reading his newspaper in the corner booth, Sarah Jenkins typing on her laptop near the window, and an older woman David didn't recognize, sitting alone at a table near the back. That's when the gray suit walked in. David's hands didn't pause in their motion of wiping down the espresso machine, but every sense he possessed went on high alert. The man was in his 50s, average height, wearing a well-tailored suit that looked expensive but not flashy. His shoes were polished leather, His watch was understated but high quality, and he carried himself with the kind of posture that suggested military or law enforcement background. But it wasn't what David saw that set off alarms in his head, it was what he felt. After 12 years in the intelligence game, you develop an instinct for when someone doesn't belong. This man didn't belong in Millbrook, and he definitely didn't belong in being there at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning. The man approached the counter slowly, his eyes doing a quick sweep of the room before settling on David. When he spoke, his voice was steady, unremarkable. "Just a black coffee, please." Large, David nodded, turned to the coffee pot, and poured. As he set the cup on the counter, he studied the man's hands. No wedding ring, but a faint tan line where one used to be. Calluses on the palms that suggested regular physical training. A small scar on the knuckle of his right index finger, the kind you get from repeated weapons handling. The man paid in cash, exact change, and moved to a table where he could see both the front door and the back exit. He sat with his back to the wall, pulled out a newspaper, and settled in like he planned to stay. David continued his routine, refilling the pastry case, updating the specials board, restocking the napkin dispensers. But part of his attention never left the man in the gray suit. Professional interest, he told himself, old habits. 20 minutes later, another stranger walked in. This one was younger, maybe early 30s, wearing jeans and a plaid shirt that screamed trying too hard to look casual. He had the build of someone who spent serious time in the gym, and when he ordered his coffee, David caught a glimpse of a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. The young man took a seat across the room from Gray's suit. Neither acknowledged the other. But David noticed the subtle positioning, the way they'd automatically created overlapping fields of observation. These weren't random customers. This was surveillance. The question was, surveillance of what or whom? David's training kicked in automatically. He began to mentally catalog everything he could observe. Gray's suit had ordered black coffee but hadn't touched it in 20 minutes. Plaid shirt was nursing a latte and checking his phone every 30 seconds. Both men were positioned to watch the street outside, but their attention seemed focused on something specific. That's when David realized they were watching the woman at the back table. She had been there when Gray's suit arrived, sitting alone with a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. David had pegged her as a tourist or maybe someone waiting for an appointment. Mid-40s dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a beige sweater and dark pants. She carried a purse but no luggage, and she'd paid for her tea with exact change from a small coin purse. Nothing about her had seemed unusual until David started paying attention to the details his training had taught him to notice. Her posture was too rigid for someone casually waiting. Her eyes moved too systematically when she glanced around the room. And now that he was really looking, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed nervously against the table. She was scared. David continued his work behind the counter, but every instinct he possessed was now fully engaged. 3 strangers in his coffee shop, 2 of them clearly conducting surveillance on the $3 in Millbrook, where the biggest excitement was usually the high school football games. This was the kind of situation that didn't happen by accident. The woman at the back table suddenly stood up. Her movement was quick, nervous, and both gray suit and plaid shirt immediately tensed. She walked toward the counter, her purse clutched tightly in her left hand. When she reached David, she leaned across the counter and spoke in a voice so low he almost didn't catch it. But he did catch it, and what she said changed everything. Mik them lot man dar katar stam. Persian, Farsi, she was asking for help, saying she was in danger. For just a split second, David's trained reflexes took over. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, he responded in the same language. Chetori mita unam komakatan konam? How can I help you? The words came out in perfect Farsi, with the precise accent of someone who had spent years in Tehran, who had learned the language not from textbooks, but from native speakers in safe houses and backroom meetings. The pronunciation was flawless, the grammar impeccable, the tone exactly right. And in that moment, everything changed. The woman's eyes widened with a mixture of relief and surprise. Graysuit's newspaper rustled as his attention snapped to the counter. Plaid shirt's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket. Tom Miller looked up from his sports section with confusion, and Sarah Jenkins stopped typing mid-sentence. The entire coffee shop went silent. David realized his mistake immediately. 18 months of careful invisibility had just been blown by one moment of instinctive response. The trained operative in him had reacted faster than the careful barista could stop him, but there was no taking it back now. The woman continued in Farsi, her voice urgent and low. Menaz Iran astam in mardamaratakip mikonand, mikdam komak. I'm from Iran. These men are following me. Please help. David's mind raced through possibilities. Iranian woman, scared, being followed by what looked like federal agents? This wasn't a random encounter. This was exactly the kind of situation he had spent his career dealing with. The kind of international complication that he had moved to Millbrook to avoid. But the woman was terrified, and despite everything, David's training hadn't included abandoning people who needed help. He responded quietly in Farsi man Modavegam Komakatun Kanam, Vali, Bayad, Aramish, dashed, bashed. I can help you. But you need to stay calm. Gray suit was now openly staring at them. Plaid shirt had stood up from his table. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely, and David knew that in the next few minutes, his carefully constructed new life was going to collapse. He made a decision. Still speaking in Farsi, he told the woman, Baron Bey Amen Mis, Dougie Gaith Panj, Cheghader, Saber, Konid. Go back to your table. Wait exactly 5 minutes. She nodded and returned to her seat, moving with the careful steps of someone trying not to attract more attention. But it was too late for that. Gray suit was already pulling out his phone, and plaid shirt was moving toward the counter. David continued wiping down surfaces, his movements calm and deliberate while his mind worked through the tactical situation. 2 probable federal agents, 1 scared Iranian woman, and a blown cover that was about to get very complicated. Plaid shirt reached the counter first. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. I'm Agent Morrison, FBI. I need to see some identification. David looked up slowly, meeting the agent's eyes with the kind of steady gaze that didn't flinch under pressure. Is there a problem, officer? That's Agent Morrison. And yes, there's a problem. You just had a conversation in a foreign language with a person of interest in a federal investigation. Tom Miller had given up any pretense of reading his newspaper and was now openly listening. Sarah Jenkins had closed her laptop and was recording everything on her phone. Gray suit had moved closer, positioning himself where he could intervene if necessary. David set down his cleaning rag and spoke calmly. I helped a customer who didn't speak much English. Is that illegal now? Don't play games, Morrison said. That wasn't broken English, and you didn't learn that language from a phrase book? I'm going to ask you again. Identification. David reached slowly into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license, the one that identified him as David Chen, resident of Millbrook, employee of Bean There Coffee Shop. Morrison studied the license, then looked back at David. This says you're David Chen? That's correct. David Chen, who speaks fluent Farsi. I speak several languages. Where did you learn them? This was the moment of truth. David could continue the fiction, claim he was a former language teacher or international businessman. He could try to maintain his cover and hope that these agents didn't have the resources or motivation to dig deeper. But one look at Gray suit told him that option was already off the table. The older agent was studying David with the kind of recognition that meant the game was over. Gray suit approached the counter slowly. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried absolute certainty. You're not David Chen. It wasn't a question. David looked at him for a long moment, then sighed quietly. No, I'm not. Morrison's hand moved closer to his weapon. Then, who are you? Before David could answer, Gray suit spoke again. He's agency. CIA, probably Middle Eastern operations, given the language skills. My guess is he's been retired and relocated under a new identity. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Morrison looked between the 2 men, clearly trying to process this information. Tom Miller's mouth was hanging slightly open. Sarah Jenkins had stopped recording and was staring with undisguised fascination. David nodded slowly. Former agency, retired, clean separation. Not clean enough, Gray suit said. Otherwise you wouldn't have blown your cover for a stranger. She asked for help, and you couldn't resist. Once a case officer, always a case officer. Morrison was getting impatient. This is all very interesting, but I still have a federal investigation to conduct. The woman at the back table is wanted for questioning in connection with an international terrorism investigation. If you've been in contact with her, she's not a terrorist, David interrupted quietly. How do you know that? David looked toward the back table, where the Iranian woman sat rigid with fear and uncertainty. In her posture, in her eyes, in the way she had asked for help, he recognized something he had seen many times before. Because I know what scared looks like, and I know what guilt looks like. She's scared, not guilty. Graysuit studied David with professional interest. What else do you know? David considered his options. He could stay quiet, let the agents handle their investigation, and hope to salvage some part of his new life. Or, he could do what he had been trained to do for 12 years. Assess the situation and act on the intelligence. He chose the latter. The woman came here alone, on foot. She's been waiting for over an hour, which suggests she's meeting someone or waiting for something specific. She paid with exact change from a small purse, which means she's operating with limited cash. Her clothes are clean but not expensive, and she's not wearing any jewelry except a plain watch. That suggests someone who's been living carefully, probably on a tight budget. Morrison was listening intently now. Go on. Her behavior indicates she's been in hiding but not on the run. If she were actively fleeing, she wouldn't be sitting in a public place this long. If she were planning something illegal, she wouldn't have asked a stranger for help. She's scared because she's in a situation she doesn't understand, not because she's guilty of something. Graysuit nodded slowly. Defector? That would be my assessment. Morrison looked frustrated. Assessment based on what? You talked to her for 30 seconds? David met his eyes. Assessment based on 12 years of reading people whose lives depended on whether I got it right? The agent considered this, then looked toward the back table. The Iranian woman was still sitting rigidly, clearly aware that she had become the center of attention, but unsure what to do about it. What did she tell you? Morrison asked. That she's from Iran, that men are following her, and that she needs help. That's it, Graysuit spoke up. What aren't you telling us? David hesitated. In the old days, this would have been the moment where he balanced competing interests, weighed potential outcomes, and made calculated decisions about information sharing. But he wasn't a case officer anymore. He was a coffee shop employee who had gotten pulled back into a world he'd tried to leave behind. She's educated, he said finally. The way she speaks Farsi, the vocabulary she uses, suggests university-level education, probably professional background. And she's been in the country long enough to know some English, but not long enough to be comfortable with it. Morrison was taking notes now. Anything else? David looked toward the woman again, then back at the agents. She called me sir when she asked for help. In Farsi, that's Uga, but she used it in a way that suggests respect for authority, not just politeness. Military family, maybe, or government background. Graysuit raised an eyebrow. You got all that from a 2-minute conversation? I got that from 12 years of training and a 2-minute conversation. Morrison closed his notebook. We need to talk to her, officially. She's already scared, David said. If you approach her like a threat, she shut down completely. Then how do you suggest we handle it? David looked around the coffee shop. Tom Miller was still pretending to read his newspaper. Sarah Jenkins was openly eavesdropping, and the Iranian woman was becoming more agitated by the minute. Let me talk to her, he said. As a translator, not an interrogator. Find out what she's really afraid of before you decide she's a threat. Morrison looked skeptical. You're not an active agent anymore. I can't just let you conduct an interview for us. I'm not asking to conduct an interview. I'm offering to help a scared woman communicate with federal agents who don't speak her language. Graysuit looked thoughtful. It might work. If she trusts him, she's more likely to cooperate voluntarily. Morrison considered this, then nodded reluctantly. But we do this by the book. Official interpreter, on the record, everything documented. David nodded. Understood. He walked around the counter and approached the back table slowly, his hands visible and his movements deliberately nodding. When he reached the woman, he spoke quietly in Farsi. Man, mikom, komaketan konam. Valubayad ba, inogatha, FBI sobat konid. Mantarjoma, mikonam. I want to help you, but you need to talk to these FBI gentlemen. I'll translate. The woman looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of hope and desperation. Shoma Matman, hasted, K-man, amniat, daram. Are you sure I'll be safe? David met her gaze steadily. Mentahade, momken komaketan mikonam. I'll help you as much as I can. She nodded slowly, then looked toward the two agents who were waiting respectfully at a distance. What followed was an hour-long conversation that gradually pieced together a story that was both simpler and more complex than anyone had expected. The woman's name was Dr. Mariam Hossein. She was a nuclear physicist who had worked for the Iranian government until she discovered that her research was being used for weapons development rather than peaceful energy applications. She had fled Iran 6 months earlier with crucial intelligence about the country's nuclear program. She had been living in a safe house arranged by Iranian dissidents in the United States, but someone had discovered her location. She had been moved 3 times in the past month, and she was terrified that Iranian intelligence agents had tracked her to Millbrook. The men following her weren't Iranian agents. They were FBI agents assigned to protect her as a valuable intelligence asset. But in her fear and confusion, she had assumed they were hunting her rather than guarding her. It was a case of crossed wires, cultural miscommunication, and bureaucratic failure to properly brief a terrified defector about who was supposed to be helping her. By the time the situation was resolved, Dr. Hossein was in tears of relief. Agent Morrison was shaking his head at the breakdown in communication, and Gray Suit was looking at David with something that might have been respect. "You read that situation perfectly," Gray Suit said as Dr. Hosseini was being escorted to a proper safe house with proper explanations and proper protection. David was cleaning up the coffee shop, which had finally emptied of customers and gawkers. It wasn't hard. Fear and guilt leave different signatures. You miss it. It wasn't a question, but David answered anyway. "Sometimes why did you retire?" David was quiet for a moment, then set down his cleaning rag. "Because after 12 years of managing other people's secrets, I wanted to see what it felt like to live without any." Gray Suit nodded. "How's that working out for you?" David looked around the empty coffee shop. At the espresso machine he had been cleaning when his old life crashed back into his new one. It was working fine until about 3 hours ago. "Your cover's blown now. You know that, right?" I figured. "Morrison's going to have to file a report. There will be questions, paperwork, background checks to verify your story." David nodded. "I expected that." Gray Suit studied him for a moment. "There might be other options, such as the agency could always use someone with your experience for consultation work. Nothing official, nothing that would put you back in the field, just occasional analysis, translation services, cultural briefings." David considered this contract work, clean contract work. You could stay David Chen, keep your coffee shop, maintain your new life, but when situations like today come up, when we need someone who speaks the language and understands the culture, we could call. How often? Hopefully not very often. Millbrook isn't exactly a hotbed of international intrigue. David almost smiled at that. Until today? Until today. David thought about the offer. It would mean maintaining some connection to his old life, some tie to the world of intelligence and secrets that he had tried to leave behind. But it would also mean that his skills, his experience, his 12 years of training wouldn't just sit unused behind a coffee counter, and it would mean that when frightened Iranian physicists asked for help in Farsi, he could respond without blowing his entire carefully constructed new existence. "What would the arrangement look like?" he asked. Gray Suit pulled out a business card and set it on the counter. "Think about it. If you're interested, call that number. Ask for Mr. Johnson." David picked up the card. It was plain white with just a phone number printed in simple black text. No name, no agency designation, no official seals. The kind of card that could disappear without a trace if necessary. "Mr. Johnson, he'll explain the details." Gray Suit headed toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, you did good work today. That woman might not have trusted us if you hadn't been here to translate. She just needed someone to listen. Not everyone would have heard what she was really saying." After the agents left, David stood alone in his coffee shop, holding the business card and thinking about choices. For 18 months, he had served coffee and kept his head down and tried to convince himself that his old life was just a memory. But today had reminded him that some skills, once learned, never really go away, and some responsibilities, once accepted, never really end. He looked around their coffee shop, at the familiar espresso machine and the handwritten specials board, and the corner booth where Tom Miller read his newspaper every morning. This was his life now, the simple, quiet existence he had chosen when he walked away from the CIA. But maybe it didn't have to be an either-or choice. Maybe he could be David Chen the barista and still use the skills he had developed as a case officer. Maybe he could serve coffee in Millbrook and occasionally help scared Iranian physicists communicate with FBI agents. Maybe the best cover for a retired CIA operative wasn't complete invisibility. Maybe it was selective visibility. David tucked the business card into his wallet, next to his driver's license that identified him as David Chen, resident of Millbrook. Tomorrow morning, Mrs. Patterson would come in for her decaf with 2 creams. Jake would grab his black coffee and blueberry muffin. The nurses would order their complicated drinks with extra shots and alternative milk. And David would remember every order without writing anything down, just like he always did. But now, if someone walked into Bean there and asked for help in Farsi or Arabic or any of the other 6 languages, he spoke fluently. He would know exactly what to do. He would listen, he would assess. And if necessary, he would call Mr. Johnson, because some habits die hard, and some skills are too valuable to waste on a perfectly ordinary life. The next morning, David opened Bean there at exactly 5:30 a.m., just like he always did. He prepared the espresso machine, arranged the pastries in the display case, and updated the specials board with the same quiet efficiency that had made him invisible for 18 months. When Mrs. Patterson arrived for her decaf with 2 creams, she found him exactly where she expected, behind the counter, ready with her order before she had to ask for it. "Morning, David," she said, counting out exact change. "Quiet day yesterday?" David smiled as he handed her the coffee. "Just another ordinary day in Millbrook, Mrs. Patterson." She nodded and headed for the door, never noticing that her barista's sleeve had shifted just enough to reveal the edge of a small tattoo. A simple design, meaningless to most people, but instantly recognizable to anyone who knew what to look for. The seal of the Central Intelligence Agency, because sometimes the most dangerous men are the ones who look completely ordinary. And sometimes the best place to hide a spy is behind a coffee counter in a town where nothing ever happens, until it does.